They built a perfect digital cage, but they forgot to account for spite. And when Elias Thorne sold our trust, I decided to teach his empire a devastating lesson. This is the story of how a single, beautiful lie brought down the global identity matrix. The first thing you have to understand about Elias Thorne is that he didn't just build a system. He built a cage, and we were all willingly clicking into the bars. His creation, the Global Identity Matrix, or GIM, wasn't some clunky government database tacked onto an old mainframe. It was seamless. It was beautiful. It was everywhere. Walk into a coffee shop, and the scanner recognizes your retinas and your gait before the barista knows your name. Step onto a maglev train, and the system verifies your passport, your health profile, and your credit score simultaneously. Swipe your hand across the reader, and boom, you are authenticated, verified, and monetized. Elias Thorne was the architect of modern convenience, and in my mind, he was a god, a titan of silicon and steel. I was one of his most dedicated early users, which meant I was also one of his most meticulously tracked subjects. My data was probably the gold standard: high-resolution retinal scans, voice prints calibrated to 99.9% accuracy, gait analysis profiles, and a perfect, unbroken history of consumption habits, travel patterns, and even the micro-expressions I made when I paused to consider ordering a latte versus an espresso. I knew, intellectually, that this was the price of living in the optimized 21st century. But deep down, buried beneath the daily hum of efficiency, I felt a profound, quiet trust in Elias. He was the gatekeeper, and he promised the gate was secure. Until the day the gate shuttered. It started subtly. A flicker in the transaction log. A fractional delay when I tried to board the morning express. Then, the system began misattributing small chunks of data. My favorite streaming service started showing profiles that were close to mine. A man with my height, but a slightly different jawline. A woman with my consumption habits, but a completely different regional dialect. The subtle errors grew bolder. One afternoon, I tried to pay for groceries, and the reader flashed a warning: potential mismatch. Verification required. I sighed, reached for my physical card, and waited for the automated override. Just as the override initiated, a pop-up appeared, not from the grocery chain, but from a satellite notification: successful cross-referencing of biometric markers complete. Source unknown. That was when the chill went from my fingertips up into my chest cavity, settling like a block of ice in my stomach. This wasn't a glitch. This was an intrusion. Someone hadn't just accessed the GIM, they had reached into the heart of it, sifted through its billions of perfectly filed identities, and plucked mine. And the knowledge that they were sifting through all of them was a horrifying realization. The next few weeks were a descent into digital paranoia. I started double-checking my identification, refreshing my credit reports, and actively monitoring the small, digital footprint I left in the world. The errors multiplied. My retinal scan, once flawless, was now occasionally flagged as belonging to a person in Shenzhen, even when I was standing in a dimly lit bookstore in Portland. My voice print, tested against the central server, was sometimes matched to a slightly gravelly baritone. A profile I was certain belonged to a guy named Marcus who frequented the local dive bar. The anger started as a simmer, a low, throbbing heat behind my eyes. It was the anger of a betrayed child, a ruined trust, a fundamental violation of the social contract that Elias Thorne had so expertly engineered. He sold us safety in exchange for our data, and now that safety was vaporized. I knew the data had been sold. It was too clean, too targeted, too efficiently disseminated across the dark web markets. They weren't selling generic datasets, they were selling verified, high-value identities. They were selling trust, and they were selling it cheap to the highest bidder. Probably some corporate rival, or maybe even a hostile government entity looking to quietly deplatform the competition. I didn't want a refund. I didn't want a public apology from a heavily scripted PR department. I didn't want a new, slightly shinier GIM interface. I wanted systemic, elegant, irreversible pain. I wanted to make Elias Thorne feel the sheer, horrifying loss of control that I felt every time that little verification screen lagged. I wanted to make him understand that while the data was his property, the integrity of his system, the very soul of his empire, was mine. The plan took shape in a sleepless, adrenaline-fueled frenzy. I spent 3 weeks in a state of hyperfocus, fueled by lukewarm coffee and pure, distilled spite. I didn't go back to the surface, to the glossy white papers and the keynote speeches. I dove deep into the architecture, into the back-end code, into the proprietary logic gates that governed the GIM. I studied the data flow pathways, the failsafes, the distributed network redundancies. Elias built the cage to be impenetrable. But even the most brilliant architect leaves a latch, a pressure point, or a single, foundational line of code that holds the entire mechanism together. My goal wasn't to simply breach the defenses. That would be crude. My goal was to take the system and force it to eat itself. The central vulnerability I found wasn't a firewall flaw, it was a philosophical one. Elias had designed the GIM with absolute faith in the source data. Every single verification, every transaction, every movement was predicated on the assumption that the inputted biometric data was 100% genuine and unique to the individual. He had built a perfectionist's religion. My revenge could be rooted in that faith. I needed to inject a subtle, highly complex piece of code, a phantom identity, a ghost profile into the matrix. This wasn't just adding another user. This was adding a corruption to the very definition of identity. The ghost profile would be a perfect composite of several high-value, unwitting identities, but with one tiny, meticulously crafted flaw. A signature that existed just outside the accepted parameters of human variation. I coded the ghost. It was a digital masterpiece, a fractal of perfect deceit. It existed in the ether, blending in, interacting with the system, consuming resources, and generating perfectly legitimate, yet fundamentally impossible, data streams. For a full week, I ran the ghost in shadow mode. I watched it travel across the network. It authenticated successfully at the Geneva airport scanner. It processed a transaction at the Tokyo metro gate. It logged a voice profile during a call in London. And the system accepted the slight, unquantifiable tremor in the pitch as normal human variation. It was brilliant. It was insidious. It was the perfect lie. The final stage was the payload. The ghost wasn't just going to exist. It was going to interact with the core identity logic in a recursive loop. It was going to force the system to attempt to reconcile two mutually exclusive definitions of a single identity, pushing the GIM to its absolute limit. The trigger was set for 3 o'clock GMT, the moment when global network traffic peaked, ensuring maximum pressure and minimum redundancy checks. I watched the clock tick down, my breathing shallow, my knuckles white against the worn plastic of my terminal. The rage, which had been a roaring fire, settled into a cold, focused, crystalline certainty. This was going to be clean. This was going to be poetic. 2 minutes. The server lights in my apartment glowed a nervous, frantic blue. 1 minute. The phantom identity, which I had internally named Echo, was poised to cross the main synchronization hub. 30 seconds. A sudden, almost imperceptible spike in the background hum of the computer. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. 4 seconds. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. The system hiccuped. A tiny, almost musical squeak of resistance. 1 second. 0. The moment the ghost profile fully locked into the core matrix. The GIM didn't crash with a dramatic, fiery explosion. It didn't scream. Worse, it sighed. The reaction was terrifyingly quiet. First, the green status lights on my screen went dark, replaced by a swirling, sickly orange. Then, across the entire network interface, the flawless, reassuring affirmation that had defined modern life, authenticated, welcome, began to stutter. Then the stuttering turned into a chorus of infinitesimal errors. The street scanner outside my window flickered, displaying for a full 3 seconds. Error, identity conflict, source unverifiable. The digital clock on my wall, normally a steady, beautiful cascade of numbers, flashed. Error, retinal scan 99.9% match. Voice print 99.8% match. Gate profile 99.99% match. Conflict detected. The system was trying to make sense of a perfect contradiction. A single entity that was simultaneously slightly too tall, slightly too fast, and held a specific, impossible confluence of biometric markers. I watched, transfixed, as the network began to rapidly degrade. The orange bled into a deep, furious red. Transactions started failing en masse. Maglev trains ground to an immediate, screeching halt. Store doors refused to unlock. The gentle hiss of the air conditioning in my apartment suddenly sounded frantic, as if the infrastructure itself was panicking. I knew he was watching. He would be in his sleek, minimalist office, staring at the main dashboard, seeing the red tide wash over his carefully curated perfect world. He would see the data lines, the streams of certainty, collapsing into a muddy, chaotic slurry. Then, the ultimate, devastating consequence began. The GIM didn't just stop validating identities, it started actively questioning them. It began flagging entire demographic clusters. Because the ghost profile had intertwined with so many high-value identities. The perfect student, the successful venture capitalist, the beloved geriatric artist. The system began to doubt the whole batch. Within minutes, the localized failures escalated into global shutdowns. Airlines were grounded because their pilot's biometric profile was momentarily tagged as suspiciously composite. Major banks froze accounts because the individual's unique signature was flagged as statistically improbable. Elias Thorne's cage. The magnificent, ironclad cage had turned inward. It was consuming its own occupants. The final, masterful touch was the subversion. The GIM was designed to always provide a definitive answer, yes or no. By forcing the system to recognize echo, I had forced it to declare, maybe. The word maybe was the death knell of his empire. It introduced ambiguity into the sacred realm of identity. And ambiguity is the enemy of pure, centralized control. As the frantic red glow pulsed across my screen, the system finally gave up the ghost, literally. The massive central core went dark, the entire matrix freezing into a monumental, silent failure. Every notification stopped. The ambient digital hum of the world dropped to a dead, heavy silence. I leaned back in my chair, the adrenaline beginning its slow, blissful ebb. My chest felt hollowed out, but simultaneously it felt perfectly, gloriously full. The vengeance wasn't just the crash, it was the existential doubt. It was the realization that the perfect man, the god of seamless living, had been defeated not by a brute force attack, but by a single, beautiful, perfect lie. Elias Thorne, the man who sold our trust for convenience, was now stuck in the worst possible reality. A world where his data could lie. A world where his gates could stutter. A world where, for the first time in a decade, people had to wait for a human to manually verify their existence. And as I looked at the frozen screen, seeing the final, damning error message, Identity status, undecided. I realized the quiet, righteous fury had found its perfect outlet. He hadn't just lost his system. He had lost his certainty. And that, to me, was worth every second of the agonizing, glorious wait.